Hello, we're back, and in this video lecture, we're going to cover procedures on the musculoskeletal system. One thing about the musculoskeletal system that's good to be clear on is that there are different characters for the first two characters for muscles, tendons, bursa, ligaments, and head and facial bones. You can see those illustrated here. So if you're tempted to go somewhere else, just be sure that you're reading the note carefully to see what all was entailed and what they were actually doing the procedure on. We have other first two characters here for the upper bones, the upper joints, the lower joints. And again, if you get these, you're 2/7 of the way there to getting the correct code. And table 16.1 will give you the root operations. And these are the same root operations we've seen before. And these are anything that we would do to muscles, tendon, bursa, ligaments, head, facial bones, upper bones, lower bones, upper joints, lower joints, and so on. And again, here's an example of a musculoskeletal code using the section for lower bones. We know the first two characters are going to be 0Q. We can look in our code book or reference table 16.2 for the third character. And these are the same root operations that we've seen throughout the course. These are things involving change, division, destruction, drainage, excision, extirpation, and so on. Now that we've covered the first three characters, we have the fourth character, which is the body part. Here is where things can get very complicated in terms of, is it the knee or is it the patella? If we figured out that it's the patella, is it the right patella or the left patella? And we need to read this very, very carefully. For those of you who haven't taken anatomy in a little while, it may be helpful to have a medical dictionary with you. Let's take a look at table 16.3 in your text to see the fine level of detail for the fourth character. And this is where things get complicated. If we have vertebrae, we need to be clear on whether it's lumbar vertebrae or if it's the sacrum, pelvic bone right or pelvic bone left, and so on. We even get into the level of detail about the femur. As opposed to ICD-9, we're no longer just dealing with the femur per se. What we need to know is it the upper femur, right or left? Is it the femoral shaft, right or left? Or is it the lower femur, right or left? Before you start on any of the exercises, please make sure you're familiar with what each of these terms, in terms of the body parts and values, mean before you attempt this exercises and the homework. Table 16.4 in your text is similar, but in this case, we're looking about the approaches. Is it open? Is it percutaneous or percutaneous endoscopic, or is it external? 16.5 talks about the different devices that are used in the lower bones, and these could be internal fixation devices or external fixation devices, intramedullary devices, autologous tissue substitutes, and so on. This is another area where you'll have to understand and read the procedure note to be clear on exactly what was done and what device was used. Table 16.6 for the seventh character is for the qualifier. And sometimes procedures are done for diagnostic procedures, sometimes they are done on the sesamoid bones, and so on. You can see those very clearly in Table 16.6 in your text. Now let's take a look at something a little bit more complicated. This is arthroscopic surgery. And basically with this, we use an instrument called an arthroscope to examine the inside of a joint and perform a diagnostic or therapeutic procedure within the joint. And we can do these on any joints, the knee, the shoulder, the wrist, and the ankle. Arthroscopic approach is percutaneous endoscopic. So anytime we see a procedure that's arthroscopic, the approach will be percutaneous endoscopic. If one of these procedures is done without an additional procedure, it is coded as the root operation of inspection. So if they did nothing else and they just did use the scope to look at the interior of a joint, it is an inspection. If they do a definitive procedure, the definitive procedure is coded. So an excisional debridement of a hip joint with the approach of percutaneous endoscopic, we would see as illustrated in Table 16.7. Joint replacement is come a long ways in the last 20 years. And with these joint replacements, we're taking out a damaged or diseased joint and replacing it in with either a biological or synthetic material that takes the place and the purpose of the old joint. Lower joints will use the first three characters of 0SR. Upper joints will use the first three characters of 0RR. And again, one of the things that's been a game changer for a lot of these hip replacements are the different types of materials that we use for these artificial joints. They can be metal, they can be ceramic, they can be ceramic on polyethylene, they can be ceramic on polyethylene, they can be synthetic, they can be oxidized zirconium, they can be autologous tissue substitutes, and non-autologous tissue substitutes. Knee replacements have specific characters that replace this. These could be oxidized zirconium, polyethylene, autologous tissue substitutes, and so on. Likewise, with shoulder replacements, we have the choices: reverse ball and socket, synthetic, autologous, non-autologous tissues, and so on. Hip and knee replacements require a seventh character, a qualifier, as we need to know whether it's cemented or uncemented, or no qualifier if unknown. Since these procedures typically are billing insurance, I have yet to see one where they didn't have a seventh character for the qualifier being unknown. And that's all I have for you. Please stop by office hours or reach out if you have any questions regarding this material. Bye now.